Welcome to NCIA's newest webinar. My name is Steve Fox, one of the co-founders of the National Cannabis Industry Association, here with Michael Correia, who is the Director of Government Relations for NCIA. We're here working out of the NCIA DC office, where Michael and his crew, including Michelle and Maddie and others, do their work to influence members of Congress and promote the policies that we're pushing. My role with the association is directing the Policy Council, and that is part of the association that produces white papers and other thought pieces to try to influence members of Congress and policymakers across the country. And we'll be talking a bit more about that work at the end of this webinar, but we're really going to start with a real focus on the legislative work that Mike and the team do here. And I would note that we've both been doing this for quite a long time. I started with NCIA at its founding in 2010. Michael came along in 2013. It's been here just over 5 years now, and we've spent most of that time really educating members of Congress about the importance of the industry, the jobs that it's creating, tax revenue, and just generally how we should be treated like any other business. So we are really continuing that work, of course, but things have really picked up in recent years. The issue is becoming more and more popular with the American people and more popular with members of Congress as well. And it seems like we're kind of at a tipping point here. So with that, we thought we'd start with a brief election recap. There was actually another webinar earlier that was really focused on the election, but we figured we'd just start with the real basics here and maybe get Michael's perspective on what it means that we now have Democrats in control of the House.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. Thanks for the opportunity just to chat. And as you mentioned, this is starting my 6th year, and for the first time in 6 years, we actually have a Chamber of Congress that's actually interested in this. All the years I've been dealing with this, we've had Republican leadership, the Republican Party, who's never been really supporting this and embracing this. And so for the first time, I'm really looking forward to 2019 and beyond. And as you said, I think it's really going to speed up the momentum that we've had. Since I began doing this 5 years ago, my focus was getting members of the Republican Party to embrace this issue, support this issue, be comfortable with this issue, and try to support some of our legislative initiatives to support the banking, support the tax, to get the federal government out of the way as far as it came to enforcement. Although we've had some successes, we just really never had that support across the Republican Party that we had hoped for. And starting, about a year ago, I just started to take a more aggressive approach to supporting Democrats with our PAC donations. I had tried to keep it equal and to grow the Republican base. And I just decided that the Republicans had 5 years to come around to our issue, and that they weren't actually coming around to our issue, and it was time to get more aggressive with our approach. And so our PAC Michelle had looked at about 30 races that actually had a chance where the Democratic challenger had a chance to beat an incumbent Republican that was bad in a district that could be winnable. And we made about 20 to 30 donations to these challenger races to achieve a good outcome, and we won about 20 of them. And so I'm really excited. That went, I think a long ways to help flip the House and to give us a better outcome. And so that was our main focus. During this time when a lot of Democratic challengers were coming in, they would come into our office, we would sit down, we would discuss all the issues, we'd hand out our paper, our priority legislation. They were well versed on this issue. So I think coming into this new Congress, you're going to have a really educated class. I think it's about 95 freshman members that are in, and I would guess that a vast majority of them are going to be good on this issue, which really is really going to be great. Now the Senate was not the same, although that was going to be a heavier lift because a lot of those states where the campaigns were in Republican Trump-led states, and so there's going to be really hard to get a good outcome in that. But I am positive that in 2020 we can actually have a good Senate too. It was sad. It was sad to see our good champion Dana Rohrabacher lose. It was sad to see Carlos Curbelo lose in Florida. They had taken this issue and embraced this issue and led on this issue, and so I think they were they had gotten swept out just on this Democratic blue wave that has taken in, and it's really hard. It's sad to see them go, but they are going to be replaced by Democrats who are good in this issue, and you are going to see now Democratic House. We don't need a Republican majority. We just need a good Republican base to have a supermajority. And so I'm really good with the election. I'm really happy. NCIA, I couldn't have been happier with the election results.
Let's shift to the legislative agenda and really bang through that and talk about what happened last session and what's going to be coming up. And we can start with what was at one point known as the Rohrabacher Amendment, been known as the Leahy Amendment.
Yeah.
Long ago it was known as the Hinchey Amendment. It's had many names, but this is the amendment that ensures that the Department of Justice can't spend any money to interfere with state medical marijuana laws. So that seems pretty secure now, yes?
Yes, and I remember back when you and I were looking back now when we are in strategy meetings on the Hill, you and I are the only people that were in the room going back to before the Rohrabacher Farr initiative passed, and you even predate me with the Hinchey Amendment. You know the history. Because the Democrats have taken over the House and the new chair of the Rules Committee, Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, has already said that he will allow all of these amendments to reach the House floor. I'm extremely confident and fairly certain that these will all pass by a supermajority. And so there are different amendments that basically limit the federal government, and that could be banking related, limiting the Treasury Department, that could be DOJ related, limiting on medical marijuana and adult use marijuana, that could be related to 280E. We're going to give it a run to possibly tie the hands of the IRS so they can't interfere with states and that are making standard business deductions. So there's lots of different options on the appropriations end that I think we can achieve a good result. And I don't know if you just want to talk about approps or get into just some of the bills that
I think we can get into all of them. What I guess I'd want to do for the audience is just tick through them one at a time and let them know the status of the Leahy Amendment and what we think will happen with that moving forward. Perhaps there just won't even be any votes on that. It'll just be in the base bill. Is that the thought? So
just to not get inside the Beltway too political, during the appropriations process, which funds the government for the year, appropriators did not want poison pill riders, a controversial legislation that was inserted in, and the negotiators in the House and the Senate of the committees basically decided that they were not going to allow any of these votes to come in that weren't already there. It was a decision that they made, which made the appropriations process less political, and these bills passed by overwhelming majority, but it made it harder for marijuana advocates to insert these bills in. The medical marijuana provision, which was the Rohrabacher provision, had already been in law for 4 years, and so that was easier. I think going forward, you are going to have, a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican President. And so I think you're going to see a little maneuvering with these three. You may get a good result in the House, and a lot of the issues may die out in the Senate side. And so Senator Leahy is supportive. They are going to bring that up. Again, I don't pretend to be an appropriator and to know the whole process and what type of deals are being cut. Whether getting the House to pass all of our amendments makes it easier for the Senate to embrace them, or getting these this legislative language inserted into the underlying bill on the House side makes it easier for the Senate to pass. That's going to be an issue we have to deal with. The Senate is a little different than the House. The House is just a majority. We have the Democratic majority. It's very easy to pass. The Senate, because of procedures, a lot of times you need 60 votes to move the dialogue and move the debate along. And trying to get 60 senators to agree on something is very hard, and so more deals are cut. So my hope is, as long as NCIA is not going backwards, as long as we're moving the chains forward to get a good outcome, we're going to be achieving it. And we had a strategy meeting on the Hill a week ago, and we were just mapping out what we were planning to do legislatively, approach wise. And so I am very confident on the House approach. The Senate's going to be a little heavier lift, but I think a lot of people are coalescing behind that.
So let's talk about the what's been known as the McClintock Amendment. That is one that is similar to the Rohrabacher-Leahy Amendment, but McClintock goes further and says that the federal government or the Department of Justice should not spend any funds to interfere with any state marijuana law. So what do you think the prospects are for that? I know it hasn't had much progress recently since Pete Sessions has been blocking votes on the floor in the House, and there have been questions about the wisdom of trying to push it through committee and the Senate if it didn't have support. So what do we think?
So on that end, and I try to go back to polling and where the American public is, and you sort of get a good idea where Congress is. The public in overwhelming majority supports medical marijuana. In a good majority supports adult use. And you see Congress, there is a little bit of difference. Most members of Congress are extremely supportive of medical. Some of them have some hesitations on adult use, and you see that on some of the legislation. And so I'm very confident that the McClintock Adult Use Amendment would pass overwhelmingly in the House, because the last time we had a vote was 3.5 years ago, and we only missed it by 10 votes. And just in that amount of time, the support level has grown. The issue is strategically where we dealt with is Republican-led committees that were not good on this issue, and whether we should bring this up at the committee level and whether it could work its way through. You saw the debate on the House side Appropriations Committee where they're not completely comfortable with adult use. You saw the same debate play out on the Senate Appropriations Committee, where senators, you could almost see them backing away. They were very comfortable with medical. They were not completely comfortable with going full adult use. And so this gets back to the do no harm. And as long as we're not going backwards, if we keep pushing the envelope, and maybe that means just passing it out of the House and have it ready for the Senate, or getting an underlying bill, it's going to be, it's a different animal that we're dealing with, the House and the Senate. And because the Senate is Republican-led, just working and trying to navigate that process is going to be a little different.
Yeah. So the McClintock Amendment, I don't know if you recall the exact year, but there was a vote on the floor.
Yes, it was in June of 2015.
And that received?
It lost by about 10 votes, so my guess is it was 210, 206, something like that. It was 10 to 12 votes, where it was short, where if we switched the majority of that, we would have had, we would have squeaked through.
And you think if there's a floor vote now in the House, that it will?
Just because of the support across America, how many more states have legalized since 2015, just the education that's gone on in these years, and then we have all these new freshman members, 95 new freshman members, 40 of whom are Democratic challengers that got rid of Republicans. Just the numbers are overwhelming, and so I don't think that's a heavy lift. And what's good about the McClintock provision is it doesn't legalize marijuana, it doesn't do anything at the federal level. All it does is allow the states to go forward without fear of federal prosecution, and that gives them a little more safety. And I think members of Congress are probably there now.
Right. Now I'm shifting to the States Act that people have heard a lot about, and in fact there seems to be a bit of action this week. We're filming this on Monday, December 17th, so folks know, and just over the past few days, there's been talk about Senator Gardner trying to get a vote on the States Act during the Criminal Justice Reform Bill. So we can talk a little bit about that. Probably don't want to prognosticate too much, but let's just talk about the bill generally and what it would do. And take things from there.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, because of the filming of this, who knows how this is going to play out, and there is a vehicle that will probably get support, and I know Senator Gardner is trying to attach it on, which would be amazing for two reasons, whether it passed or didn't. It would be the first time we could have a good marijuana-related vote in the Senate, and we would have a good idea where these senators stood on some of these issues. And our biggest issue, is allowing the states to go forward without fear of federal interference on this. The end goal is legalization at the federal level, but in this short term, allowing these states to operate. And Republicans believe in federalism, and this is a perfect way for them to stand up for what they actually believe in, which is allow their own states to be able to go forward. And so this would be a great vote. The States Act, to me, it always came across as a reaction to the Cole memo getting torn up last January, which we're almost at the year-long anniversary of that, which was a horrible day, as a response to sort of codify, hey, this is happening, these states aren't going anywhere. Instead of having this conflict keep going on, Congress can pass some legislation that allows these states to go forward. And so I thought it was a good incremental approach. Senator Gardner has shown a lot of, he's taken the big lead on this, which has been wonderful. And I think it gives Republicans a safe area. It's a good bill before we get to the promised land of legalization at the federal level. And so there's tremendous support for it. At one time, we didn't want it to be too much of a Democratic bill, and so we were waiting for a good Republican and Democrat to get it on at the same time so it looked equal, and it was a truly bipartisan bill. And so you've seen an uptick in Democratic sponsorships because now that the House is Democrat, I think they're just open to getting as many co-sponsors on as possible. So I think this is a good bill that can be incremental and can be discussed and address a lot of the issues that we're dealing with now.
Right. So folks know, I know you know, but just to have it for folks who are watching, the States Act really doesn't make marijuana legal across the board at the federal level, but says that if you are acting in compliance with state marijuana laws, you will be exempt from the provisions of the Controlled Substances Act. So basically what you're doing is no longer illegal at the federal level. There are also a couple of provisions that address the 280E tax issue by redefining what trafficking is, and then address the banking issue as well.
Yeah, and our NCIA's focus is addressing the banking issue, addressing the tax issue, and this is a good step in that direction. And so I'm really optimistic. This has been one of the bills that we have on our priority list when we lobby and talk about. And so it'll be good to see. I'm a realist, and whatever Congress is willing to move and whatever we can get out of a Congress is something I'm willing to push more of. And if this is the bill that gets traction and gets legs, then we'll definitely be there to help out because it does address some of these issues.
Great. Yeah, and you made an interesting point. I'll just bring this up. Yes, I was thinking about when you said it, the significance of if this amendment or the bill being added to the Criminal Justice Reform Act that's moving this week is considered germane and the Senate gets a vote on it, it really is an opportunity to see where senators stand and figure out if this comes up next session, which there's a good chance it might at some point, that who to lobby, who to put more pressure on. And that's the Hinchy Amendment, which became the Rohrabacher Amendment, Leahy Amendment that we talked about earlier. That was our original plan with MPP way back in 2003. We just wanted there to be a floor vote in the House so we could start seeing who was supported.
And you have the history, and we've not really had a true marijuana amendment come to the Senate. And so everyone goes, what do the senators stand? And, politicians are politicians. I've been around long enough. A lot of them will say, oh, I'll support you if we have a vote, knowing that they're never going to get a vote and they don't have to take a position. Now, it's a great opportunity for them to actually have to take a position. And so they just can't talk out of both sides. They actually have to stand up, and they support federalism, they support their states or not. And what's great about our approach and the States Act and this, you don't have to support legalization at the federal level. All you're saying is the states should be the ones who determine their own outcome, and that's an easier lift. And I think that's something Republicans should be embracing across the board. And so it would be great if we could actually get a vote and to see where the members are, and then we could put pressure on them from their states or just our lobbying, or actually see what type of questions they have and then try to address some of those questions.
All right, let's shift to banking.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple ways we can talk about banking. One is to just talk a bit about the banking amendments that have come up during the appropriations, but also the Safe Banking Act as well, which is considered more of a permanent fix. Of course, an appropriations fix would be in place for as long as the appropriations bill is in place, which is one fiscal year. So that would be helpful, but a permanent fix obviously is better. So what are thoughts? Maybe talk a little bit about what happened with banking last year, a little bit about the debates and the appropriations.
Yeah, and that is one of the frustrating things is no matter how successful we've been, no matter how hard we try, no matter how many groups that are supportive of this and pushing for this, is to not be able to get an outcome in Congress because the Republican leadership would block everything. And so the Safe Banking Act, I think, has 95 to 100 co-sponsors, somewhere in there. That's almost a quarter of Congress supporting a bill, which is amazing. And so you don't see often bills getting that amount of support. And so just the fact that Congress has flipped and the Democrats are in control, that means our legislation is in committees of jurisdiction where now Democrats are chairing these committees. And so the Safe Banking Act goes through the House Financial Services Committee, which is chaired by Maxine Waters of California, which is going to be the largest state.
She's already said something favorable about
this. California, as you know, is the largest state. It's going to have the biggest issues with banking. She knows about this issue, and that opens up the possibility of having a hearing on this, which would be great, to move legislation through the committee or to actually have this committee push forward and try to get a vote on the House floor. And so I know, I've been doing this for many years, and to try to get some of the banking organizations behind this has been hard. Just in this past year, you had some of the community bankers getting behind this. You had some of the credit unions getting behind this. The American Banking Association has always looked at this as a regional issue, and they haven't taken on this at the national level. But now they're to the point where they've polled their members, they've discussed this members, and it's actually lifted up on their radar screen where I can see them getting very active pushing this. Why is that important? Because when we just lobby on an issue, it's just us. But when all these banking groups lobby on an issue, it gives members of Congress more safety in knowing that the bankers are behind this. This is something that they can deal with in their communities, and it makes it a lot easier for them to support it if we've built this broad support on something like this. So I'm really hopeful that the Banking Association, plus, and let's be honest, they carry a lot of money, and that's it helps to do more campaigns, educate people on this issue. And so of all the issues we deal with, the banking issue tends to resonate with the public. They get it. They see the stories. This is one issue almost every politician I talk to, whether they're supportive or not, always say, we have to address the banking issue. We have to address the banking issue. So that's in their consciousness. They understand it. So I think, I don't know everything, but the one thing I think, if one bill were to shake loose and move through, I think banking would be a good one. I mentioned having a strategy session last week on the House side, and we went around the room to ask what the priority was for most of the groups and some of the lobby groups. And half of them, it was banking, the banking issue, coalescing around the banking issue, which makes me very happy. You've been doing this for so long, you know how important it is to get banking for our industry members to just be legitimized. And so that resonates a lot. The other issue is banking for medical and banking for adult use, because I know that is dividing some Senate offices in some members, and so we embrace banking for all, but just having to navigate the appetite on Capitol Hill of what we can get through. But it is one I think that can get through.
Right, and that played out the the adult use versus medical played out a little bit in committee
Yes.
last year on
Yeah.
banking.
If you-
the appropriations committee.
Yeah, if you saw the debate, they tabled the discussion on this bill, and you had senators who supported it on medical, who maybe weren't completely comfortable going forward on adult use, and you saw the debate, a very vigorous debate on the House appropriations process about that. And that's just one of the issues the advocates have to deal with, is how far they're willing to push. None of us want losses, especially at the committee level, and have a record. But that's just something we have to deal with and navigate of whatever Congress is willing to give us. And it's important to our members, and we're pushing for it. It's just being able to get a good outcome.
Right. Well, summarizing a lot of what we've said, I think we could say that we would assume in the upcoming session of Congress that at least on the House side, that I guess they call it the Joyce Amendment now. This is the Roebuck Amendment. For folks who are interested, it's probably going to be known as the Joyce Amendment. David Joyce, a Republican out of Ohio, who took the lead in committee this year. He's on the Appropriations Committee. So I would suspect that in the House that you will see passage of the Joyce Amendment on medical. I'm not sure what the adult use version will be called or whose name will be on it, whether it's McClintock or someone else. Maybe that will happen in committee, maybe not, but at least on the House floor, where we'd expect it would have sufficient votes, and banking as well through the House. So that seems pretty
You
secure.
bring up one good issue, because members leave, and it was the Hinchy. How many people would even remember that, go back in the time machine? And when I go to conferences and I ask I take a poll of who was around before Rohrabacher or Farr, who even know what it means. Because members' names are changing, the advocates are looking at pushing as adult use amendment, medical amendments, veterans amendments, banking. So it's not attached with the name, but you do have a name attached with everything. So David Joyce has been the lead. Tom McClintock has been the lead previously, and with Polis. But now that the majorities has switched, whether you do Democratic lead and then a Republican co-sponsor, just so it's a Democratic name, that could change, but the same concept applies: adult use, medical, vets, and just go down the list.
All right. Well, let's switch to 280E, the tax provision that prevents cannabis businesses from deducting standard business expenses. We discussed that a bit as potentially being part of the States Act, or it is part of the States Act, but we'll see what happens with the prospects for the States Act. But what about 280E more generally as a standalone piece of legislation, perhaps being attached to some other vehicle? Any thoughts about the prospects on that?
Just the reality of how Congress deals with tax bills. A standalone 280E bill probably isn't going to happen. So you're looking for some type of vehicle, and in 2017 that vehicle was tax reform, which we gave it a run. NCIA had done a study of what the industry would look like, what type of hit it would have on the federal budget, whether it would be a plus or a negative, and to build a case around supporting 280E. We just did not have the support in 2017. We're getting closer, but it is a lot harder to deal with Republicans who are not embracing this issue to want to support it. Senator Wyden, who's the ranking member of the Tax Writing Committee of the Senate, is the co-sponsor of the bill. If that seat were to flip and he were chairman, it would be a lot easier moving the bills, moving the 280E bill. The Democrats, some have talked about revisiting tax reform, closing some of these loopholes, having another package, increasing the corporate rate. I'm not going to get into the politics of that, but that could be a vehicle to get this bill moved through. It's a lot easier now that the Democrats are controlling Congress to actually have a discussion on this bill and to talk about it just not being swept under the rug. And as you mentioned, the States Act does address the 280E component, and so even if there isn't the tax component getting that through, there's just the state's bill passing that through other committees' jurisdiction. If that had traction, getting that through and addresses the same issue. And so we're covering both. As I mentioned before, I'm a political realist. Whatever Congress is willing to do, I'm willing to get behind that and support it. And so that's something I think would be big for our industry. You know, we had mentioned banking before, just for our industry to be able to have these deductions that's keeping us from reaching our potential. The tax issue is not, it doesn't resonate with members of Congress and the public because they don't want to get it because it's a tax issue. So it's a little harder to lobby on that just because the topic's a little more not as exciting as the banking issue, which everyone gets.
Okay, one other piece of legislation I thought we'd touch upon is the respect resolution that Barbara Lee introduced that puts forth some best practices for bringing more justice, social equity to the burgeoning industry. Any general thoughts about that?
Well, I know when they had been drafting the legislation, they had reached out, and I know you had worked with their office to make some additions, bring some points that were important to you in the industry. It is a resolution, which doesn't mean it's not codified, it's not law, but it's almost the intent of Congress of what they're thinking, and it's a good sort of idea of what Congress thinks and what the state should be doing on this. I think it's a good starting point. It's a good bill. Their office has been great to work with, and I think it gives a good guideline to what I think the industry should be striving for.
Yeah. No, I think it's good to point out that the resolution does actually provide suggestions for states that are moving forward, and talks about how funds can be invested in communities and programs that would help minorities, towards ownership as well as executive positions and employment in the industry and so on. So I think this is going to be, it already is a significant issue that a lot of folks are talking about, but something that we will be focusing on, and in fact NCIA through the Policy Council is working.
And on that point, you bring up a good point. You know, to me, as the states have been implementing, there have been sort of different regulatory structures. You could have a Washington State versus a Colorado versus a California. I don't think there's a perfect one, but I do think certain ones work better than others, and I think we as an industry should be striving to get the best possible outcome. And this is a good point in the direction.
Yeah, and I think we'll shift in that direction. I'll talk a little bit about what the Policy Council is doing, because as you said just then, for us to talk about how these state laws are evolving and what some best practices are, that's something that we really do want to focus on. But I did, while we're still talking about the legislation, thought it would be appropriate to mention lobby days that will be coming up early next year. Never too early to sign up. Any details to provide?
Yeah, I think the official dates I think are May 21st, 22nd, 23rd, whatever that week is. It's probably Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We're still working out the details. The only thing is members, they have to be members of NCIA. So first thing, if you're not a member, make sure you join and do that. A lot of our members really like this. They're excited about this. This is one of the events that we put on that really excites them. They like to see what we're doing. They like to see what our focus is, and they like to be able to participate and sort of see what's behind the curtain, how DC works. And so it'll be more the same. The numbers will probably be bigger than last year. I always, this would be, I think, my 6th lobby day I've done, and being able to see the crowds almost double every year, and to where we're up into the 300 to 400s, which is amazing. We're hitting most of these offices, and we're telling a story about a professional industry that should be treated like every other industry in America. And I think it's really important. I deal with politicians, and they're trying to get a perception of what the cannabis industry is, and it's a great opportunity for us to showcase and just tell that story to congressional offices. And we're going to have 95 to 100 freshman members coming in, and so these are going to be new offices to be able to see this industry. We've talked with a lot of state legislative groups and getting that message out. So many more states are going to be thinking about legalizing, implementing legalization. which means members of Congress are care about their states, and so many more members of Congress are actually going to be interested in this, and I'm really looking forward to this year.
Great. So let me shift a little bit to the Policy Council, just to let people know the work we're doing, because as mentioned before, a lot of our work does involve looking forward, but also giving a perspective on some nuances of policy, or sometimes big picture policy. Over the past year, you mentioned, actually this started in 2017, you mentioned the 280E scoring issue and seeing what that would cost the federal government. We put out a paper on that. We put out a paper on federal tax more broadly, what that might look like, just so we can start having that conversation and have people think about what would be an appropriate tax. We've tried to highlight a couple issues that maybe are flying under the radar that are not fair to cannabis business owners, specifically paraphernalia laws. That was one we put out a paper about, because there have been some seizures of paraphernalia by customs, and that is something that shouldn't be happening. There's actually a provision of the federal paraphernalia law that says that if you are authorized to conduct this activity under state law, then you're exempt from federal law. And those who had property seized were acting in compliance with state law. Pesticides is another issue where there's an issue where you're only supposed to use pesticides on products once it's approved by the federal government, and clearly they haven't approved the use on cannabis yet. But there are special local needs exemptions, and some folks in California had applied for that, but Scott Pruitt, as the head of the EPA at the time, rejected that. So that's another issue, and also we put a little focus on international competition, which is a big deal right now. Most people know that Canada is moving ahead fast and furious, and there's a lot of investment dollars going there, and really allowing Canadian companies to get ahead of U.S. companies, and we're hoping that maybe some members of Congress will be motivated to just get us to the point of legalization, which is going to happen anyway. And it would be nice if it happened sooner rather than later, so U.S. companies really have the opportunity to compete. So that's, and I'd also mention we did a real long project on testing policy, and put out 14 recommendations for state policymakers to try to get greater consistency across the board on policy and have sensible testing policies.
Well, I just wanted to say what you guys have been doing at the Policy Council, which has been amazing. I really appreciate the papers. I deal with politicians that aren't experts in cannabis, who are sort of new to this. I always joke that for a lot of federal officials, cannabis is 101st in their top 100 list of priorities, and trying to get them knowledgeable on this issue. A lot of these members aren't reading cannabis news, so they don't know what's going on. But to be able to produce these white papers and to be able to showcase and say, hey, we're a professional industry, this is where we want to be. And you're talking about these issues that need to be talked about, of what federal policymakers are going to need to deal with a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, to get that good outcome. And so I really appreciate what you're doing. They look very professional. It's great to have this.
Great. I'm glad they help. So looking forward, we do have a couple papers in the hopper, and others that we're beginning to work on. I mentioned earlier the social equity paper. That will certainly be one of them. We also have, similar to the testing paper that I just mentioned, we're putting out a packaging and labeling paper that will talk about best practices and recommendations for policymakers in the states, which we really hope, similar to the testing policy, can lead to greater consistency from state to state, and eventually influence federal policy. Another thing we're going to be working on is a really probably detailed paper about how cannabis can and should be treated at the federal level. It's a very unique substance. You know, you have other substances like alcohol, tobacco, dietary supplements, and foods, and so on, and they all are regulated in certain ways by the federal government. But what's interesting about cannabis is it could fall into all of those categories.
Yeah.
So we really want to start that conversation and bring together a lot of experts to talk about what would be most appropriate. And then I guess a final thing I would just mention, and we haven't planned on anything specific yet, but it's interesting to think you've seen recently like the wine and spirits wholesalers coming out in support of legalization, and they're putting forth their suggestions about how cannabis should be regulated. But we obviously want our own voice there. We don't think that we should just default to being treated like alcohol. There are interesting issues to consider. Alcohol has a mandatory 3-tier system where they have to have a distribution level between cultivators and producers and retailers, but there's a lot of vertical integration in our system right now. So if they're suggesting that, how would that work in our system? So we really want to start thinking about that and putting out our own thoughts about how cannabis should be treated.
You bring up a really good point, because policymakers are already, legalization is going to happen. It's not a matter, you know, when you were starting and when you were working on this for years, it was like, okay, how long will it take to get there? It's going to be happening hopefully in the next couple of years. What do we want it to look like, and what type of regulatory system do we want? The last thing the industry would want is just randomly you pick some other industry and you pick a regulatory structure and it doesn't work. And I want to make sure we actually get one that works for us, because the cannabis plant and issue is so unique. And so I'm glad you're actually having these discussions, because I don't know what it should look like, but I know there are a lot of people, when you put them in a room and can start talking about what works and what doesn't work, they can create a good working policy of what actually works.
Great. All right, well, I think we've covered everything we're planning to cover today. So thanks for those of you who've watched this all the way through. We encourage you to be in touch with us if you have any follow-up questions. We're always happy to talk to our members and answer their questions.
Yeah, so. and thanks, Steve, and for everyone listening, you know, definitely look at lobby days coming up. Appreciate it, and then anything you can do to help our cause, and looking forward to working with everyone. So appreciate the time. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.